You're watching LTV, Comcast 34 and FIOS 26, Livingston.
Livingston. Welcome to this edition of Clergy Corner. Friends, our country has endured 17 government shutdowns over the last 40 years from President Ford to President Obama, except for George Bush. Shutdowns have been part of the political landscape. The reason? Mostly, they couldn't work out the budget. My question, is a government shutdown moral? Hi, I am Dan Martian, pastor at the Presbyterian Church of Livingston and your host. With me on today's show, please welcome Reverend Ron DePasquale from the Livingston Full Gospel Church, Cantor Sharon Brown-Levy from Temple Emmanuel, Reverend Susan Gillespie from Trinity Covenant Church, and Monsignor Thomas Nightinger from St. Philomena Roman Catholic Church. Welcome. Well, let's get to it. Tom, you have some wonderful news about the Aquinas Academy. You just received the excellent award.
We are a 2013 recipient of the National Blue Ribbon School for Excellence, and awarded by the Department of Education. We were one of 286 schools in the country who received the distinction, so we're thrilled.
Oh, so how did that impact you at your school?
Well, I don't think we've actually begun to experience the impact of it. I think we will in the coming months. We're just sort of getting used to the reality now, and we're so thrilled with it. We were down in Washington from Sunday and through Tuesday, and the ceremony was actually yesterday. And we actually received the award along with the 286 other schools, and so we're going to see what kind of impact that has down the road.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
And congratulations to your
Thank
school.
you.
My question would be, if the government was still shut down, that happened in October, would you have received that award?
Well, based on the reports that I saw in the media about the repercussions of a government shutdown, I bet you that ceremony would not have been held if there was a government shutdown at the time. I mean, we all heard stories of national parks and a myriad of other services that are provided that were not provided because the government was shut down. So I would hazard to say that that ceremony would not have been held had it been during a government shutdown.
So it does have impact. The government shutdowns do have impact. What other impact did the government shutdown have that maybe was part of congregation or faith communities that you were aware of?
Well, I don't know anyone in particular, but I know the CDC wasn't able to start several trials of experimental therapies. So people who are ill, who were going to be part of the trial, were put off and couldn't be entered into the studies. Huge impacts on people who were fighting for their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was amazed at some of the news reports out there that people who could not start their treatments, they needed to start their treatments. It was a matter of life and death. And to prolong it might have jeopardized their longevity and how they would battle the disease. I heard about WIC. The WIC program was compromised. Head Start was actually even compromised because of that. And we're not to leave out the federal employees, because the federal employees was not, paid during that whole time. And what about the military? Did the military get paid for their during this shutdown?
They were, yeah.
Yeah, I think the military.
There's a separate act, the Pay the Military Act, that provided for that. However, it was kind of a mess because the people who were supposed to make that happen weren't all there. So it was a skeleton crew making it happen. Yeah.
Is it fair for the government to shut down? What do you think, Sharon?
Well, it depends on whom it affects and how many people it will affect. I mean, I'd like to know what the goal was of this particular shutdown. If we've got a whole history, 17 plus years of all these shutdowns, perhaps each one had a specific goal in mind before the shutdown occurred. Whom was the shutdown intended to improve by creating this, or was there any sort of improvement intended by this? It's hard to say.
I know that some of my readings that I did to prep for the show today was saying that when Newt Gingrich, was working with the president at the particular time, is that he thought, well, they would look better, the Republican Party would look better. In fact, they lost out when they went to a government shutdown. And a lot of it had to do with the president vetoing a bill that didn't take place about the budget. And so it really kind of backfired on them. And maybe this, there was so much, layers to this government shutdown that happened in October, and my feeling is both sides of the aisle, they need to come together and they need to do some type of reconciliation and work together out of respect, because it's not doing any good for the American people to witness this. It seems like the government is so dysfunctional. That's the one thing about these shutdowns, is, to me, it's saying a loud cry, sending a loud message, and sending the message that the government is very dysfunctional.
And you see the reality of that in not just the shutdown, but you read it in the daily life of things that are so polarizing to both sides of the aisle. In fact, it's interesting. I also did a little bit preparation for today. I noticed that in the first few shutdowns, now again, they weren't as long as this one was. In fact, I believe one was a half a day, one was a weekend, so it didn't affect many people. But if you go to even the ones in the mid-70s, early 80s,
right, yeah.
One of the key issues that were there, I won't say it was the whole thing, was abortion. And the Roe v. Wade had just come out back in the early 70s, so that was also formulating. Here we hear today that, reports coming out about the Affordable Care Act played a major part in people not deciding to vote in. So it seems like these government shutdowns have always involved some sort of particular item that's been polarizing to people.
How does our faith inform us in matters like the government shutdown, in civil matters? Sue, what do you think?
Well, I think the problem with the rhetoric around the government shutdown was there's an implication that it won't hurt anyone. The problem is it did hurt a lot of people, and it cost the economy a great deal of money. So even if the issue is important, I'm not sure that the people who were fighting over the issue were as hurt over it as other innocent bystanders, so to speak. And that enters into the morality of it. Because it's one thing to fight for an issue, but when you're hurting other people who may even be on your side on that issue, then it stops being a moral fight.
We might have a discussion about how much of a role government should play in our lives. And commonly, the Republican Party has said less government, and the Democratic Party has said more government. But once the government takes on those services and those responsibilities, and people's lives are dependent upon them, I do think you're right, Sue. I think the moral issue comes into play. And I think when you see perhaps even the hint of dysfunction, Dan, as you said, in the air, it becomes even more of a weighty moral issue when you have it. I think much was made during the shutdown. I think it was a book by Chris Matthews, who wrote a book about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House and the President, and how they could not have been more diametrically opposed to each other, and yet they managed to find a way to work it out. And I don't know that we're seeing that, and that was the argument of the book. We're not seeing that today, or as much as then. And so I think it becomes much more moral as you begin to look at the implications and the people whose lives it touches.
When we talk about morality and we're spreading the word moral around, what do we mean by being moral? You're smiling, Sue.
Big question, small TV show. I'm going to assume it has something to do with the word mores and the kinds of things that that are unacceptable in our culture. They're unacceptable in our society. And of course, as a believer, I believe that there is a God orientation toward the idea of morals. But in a civil society, we have to accept that people come from different places on many
Right.
issues.
Right.
So I think, you have to come down to some fundamental things, and I guess I'd come back to not hurting innocents being pretty fundamental.
The lack of responsibility, would we consider that to be immoral? And was the government responsible when they said, we're going to pack our bags up, shut off the lights, and the last person in Washington, oh, by the way, turn off the dome, the light in the dome of the Capitol? Is that responsible?
I think if we can, which we never will, but if we can discover what behind the scenes they actually thought of this, what they were trying to accomplish,
That's what I was saying
what
earlier.
was brought
What
through.
was the goal?
Yeah, if it ever comes through, then we can begin to really say, okay, well, judging people's hearts, that's a difficult thing to do, and that's where the tough part is.
But why would we want to judge people's hearts?
Well, I would say we've been through this 16 other times. The senators, the congressmen, everybody there, they know pretty much the implications of what it'll bring. They know this
Right.
is not new territory for them to be involved in. I would hate to think, and it may be, this whole thing was well, we know, some will, it'll hurt this way, we'll lose money this way. But, it's not going to break us, so let's just do it and prove our point.
I think you have the
That's a
issue of
possibility.
secondary agendas. There is the presented goal, but then when you get into the fact that some people are in safe districts, and so they lose nothing by ginning up the anger of their own constituents and becoming more popular there, at the cost of people who are unrelated to that, but they don't care because they can personally lose nothing for it. I think that's when you get into these issues. And at the same time, people in unsafe districts may be being primaried from the right or whatever, and their issue is that they have to sound more like they're not going to compromise
See,
with anyone.
what brought skepticism into me was, and if I got my dates right, as the shutdown started on October 1st, I believe the bill was introduced 4 days later that said that all the furloughed workers would be compensated for their time off, which, in a sense, if I could put it that way, they would get their pay. It would be, later than what it would usually be, but they would have gotten their pay. So, in a sense, you say, were they hurt? They weren't hurt. But I like what Sue brought out, that whole underneath, the underlying group. Back in '94, baseball went on strike. Okay, labor, you couldn't agree.
Yeah.
Oh, and everybody said, these millionaires, who cares? They'll live. Well, it wasn't the millionaires that were going to be affected. It was the concession people and the ushers and all the stadium.
Right, exactly. And
Thousands of people coming in. So you really have that idea. It does hurt the underneath that we don't even talk about.
right, and what's interesting, and it didn't seem to really have a lot of play on the media, but what's interesting is that we had 2 incidences that happened in D.C. while the shutdown was occurred. We had one woman that rammed the gates in the Capitol, and she was shot. Did that have something to do with the shutdown? She was so desperate that she drove from Brooklyn to D.C. She didn't know what else to do. Possibly? Don't know. We didn't hear a lot of airtime about the man who lit himself on fire, poured gasoline on himself in the National Mall and lit himself on fire. Now, all this happened during the shutdown. Did the shutdown precipitated something like this? We'll never
Well,
know.
We'll never
But
know.
once again, when these things happen,
They coincide. It's kind of eerie.
it's very eerie, and my question and my skepticism goes toward, are they all related? Because desperate times call for desperate measures, and a lot of the people become desperate. Yeah, we talked about the retroactive pay that the federal government has. That's after the shutdown is done with.
Right.
But does that put food on the table right now at 6 o'clock tonight? No, it doesn't. A lot of these people can only afford are living from paycheck to paycheck, nothing more. And the bills don't get paid, but the bills are still mounting. I'm kind of wondering if the Congress and the senators, if their pay wasn't given during the shutdown, I wonder how different that would be.
That's right.
Yeah, there's I think a lot of hypocrisy going on. And as far as the one thing that I hear also is that, I don't want my taxes to go to the Affordable Health Care Act. I don't want my taxes to be raised. So I'm for maybe the government shutting down to make a statement. But we're forgetting about the little people. We're forgetting about the waitresses and the waiters at the diners, that their whole livelihood depends on the congressmen and senators coming to the diner for a cup of coffee, for a cheeseburger.
That's right.
And is that a moral implication?
One of my parishioners was actually affected, directly worked for the government, and was furloughed. Came to me on that Sunday and told me what was going to happen and had concern and all of that. And I directed her to the words of the Apostle Paul that he wrote to the Romans. It says, all things work together for good to those who love God. I said, do you love God? The answer was yes. I said, then just hold on. Everything, if we believe that verse, then we're going to move forward on that. I would hope that there were more ministers, clergy that took the time to speak to these people who were being affected, to offer that counsel, to offer that help, to say, we'll get through this.
Ron,
We'll
did you
work
hear of
together.
some clergy people that did that? Took the time to talk or take some time
No,
to do
I
pastoral
can't say
care?
personally, that was the only one I knew of.
Yeah.
I think another way to frame it, I mean, certainly you can get down to, and one of the things we've been talking about is with the morality of it. And I guess
Yeah.
maybe perhaps at its simplistic, or the most simplistic form is that which is moral is right and that which is immoral is wrong. So right or wrong. And of course, as you pointed out, that could range depending upon what perspective you're coming from. But another possibility and another way of framing it is in the realm of justice. In terms of justice, where is the justice in that? Is there justice or is there a lack of justice by a government shutdown? When people are, the implications. We've highlighted many of them here, and we've mentioned many of the implications from, for some maybe perhaps inconveniences, to others their whole livelihood. Is that a justice or is that an injustice that the government gets shut down for political gain, or for reasons that are other than than upright? So I don't know if that complicates the issue, but I think justice is a part of the discussion, I think.
Yeah, I think so too, because justice somewhere has to come into the issue, because we want a government that's just. We want a government that's fair for all people. And was it just, was it fair, was it equal that they decided to close down over a certain issue? And 17 other times they've closed down over a certain issue. In my sense, doesn't our faith communities inform us to reconcile, to work things out? Just don't take our ball and bat and go home until you see it my way, and we'll have a standoff until you see it my way. That doesn't do any good, and I don't see the scriptures telling us to do that. I see the scriptures telling us to work it out, to reconcile for the betterment of everybody else. We have a creed in the Presbyterian Church where we have hands of different colors that are clasping each other. It's the Confession of 1967, and it represents that the whole world should be reconciled to one another. Regardless of our differences, we share this planet, we should work it out. Regardless of our differences in DC, we should work it out. And I think our people in DC, our politicians, should step up to that and be role models, as we are role models here on Clergy Corner.
And there are people who, and we certainly heard it during the shutdown, who basically say what was happening in Washington is symptomatic of what's happening in our culture, is happening in our society today. And so that brings much to bear on ourselves here in Livingston, here in our congregations, because do we not sometimes see the division and the lack of a willingness to work differences out in our own congregations at times?
Well, then how do we do that?
Yeah.
I have a question though. Isn't it possible that in this shutdown, somehow not in front of us, not in a public eye, but perhaps in a private sense behind the scenes, perhaps the government, the politicians are trying to work something out and they don't want to air it as publicly as politics often is. It's so public. I mean, you see so much bitterness. Look at all of the advertising for political campaigns and how bitter, look how all of that is aired. Maybe perhaps behind the scenes they are trying to work something out so that whatever they're presenting to the public eye is something that represents that that capacity to communicate, which we're striving for. A lot of times I think sometimes you need a little bit of privacy before you can communicate your intentions publicly. So I'm willing to try to err on the side of positivity that they are not shutting down because they've given up, but that they're trying to work it out somehow on the inside before showing it on the outside. That's just a guess. It's only a guess.
Another
Sue.
possible good angle on that is that, you know, the polarization eventually bears fruit, which becomes something like a shutdown, and then disempowers those who want to do that and raises up other people who want to work things out. I can hope that behind the scenes, people who wound up not getting painted with the shutdown can begin to work things out.
How do you do that within our community of faith when we have divisions and we have schisms and, you know, people that don't disagree? How do we work things out for the common good of our congregations? What things have you done to work things out? Ron?
Well, I've encouraged people to concentrate, if there's division, on first of all, acknowledge what you agree on. Acknowledge what's there. I mean, if you agree on this, you agree on that, let that be first and foremost.
Oh, I'm scared if you do that, then we'll have a conflict. If you acknowledge what is there.
Yeah, well.
I'm being very facetious, but I think a lot of people don't want to.
They don't want to treat the elephant in the room.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So they're afraid of that conflict.
Well, then that's the next step is, and I go back to the verse I had before, and other verses that the scriptures tell us. It's not to walk in that fear, not to move in that fear, but to have confidence that we can work things out. Dan, one of the greatest, I think, in my personal opinion, truths of people with divisions or ideas working things out, you're looking at it right here. This group right here with
Absolutely.
different beliefs, different ideas, and different approaches to the scripture. Yet here we are. We're not a Jerry Springer show. We're a Clergy Corner, and we're here together discussing these things. So if anything, we can prove on a grassroots scale, it's possible.
Yeah.
And if there's anything that's going to be a role model on, take that. Let's see how we can work those things
Dan,
out.
I wanted to
yes.
say it depends really on what the issues are that they're presenting to each other. Where there's a division, you have to really make sure that you validate, that you show that you are listening. As clergy, you have to. Really, the first thing is never to make a judgment, and not to take a side, but to listen to every side of the story, and then perhaps to try to find whatever commonalities might exist and begin there. If you can begin there, if you cannot begin there, then to decide, well, can the people who have this rift find a way to coexist with the rift and find other things to concentrate on, to channel energy in a positive way rather than focusing on what divides them.
Right. And maybe that's the question. Not is a government shutdown moral, but how is it handled?
Well, I mean, I think you also, and I think basically it's been characterized great here, and I think Ron's example is a fine one, but I think oftentimes when you do bring these vying opinions together, I think oftentimes people are in the mode of argument, and we got to get them out of the mode of argument and into the mode of dialogue. And that's what we're talking about, basically. We're trying to bring them together. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think we need to be afraid of the conflict or the differing of opinions, but I think we need to talk about it in a calm, rational, and convincing way, and one in which we listen as well as talk.
How can that be done? How do we diffuse that anger mode so that people can sit down and listen? Have you had experience doing that? In Sharon?
I've done it several times in my life, both professionally, personally. I think that you really have to get to know a person. I think the first thing is just listening, hearing, and maybe finding a little humor in the situation. Humor is one of the best ways to diffuse anger, I think. You know, it kind of lets go a lot of the tension in the room, and then you bring them to a place where they can be receptive. You have to create the tabula rasa, the blank slate. If they got too much filling in their slate, they're not going to be receptive to anything else. You have to figure out a way for them to come from a place of, believe it or not, emptiness, so they can receive what is coming to them.
I've been involved with Kaleidoscope Institutes out of Los Angeles, and Eric Law, who's the executive founder of this. does exactly what you were talking about, Sharon, is get to know one another. He does it through Kaleidoscope Bible Study, where you share a passage of Scripture and then you talk about it 3 times, and you get to know each other's insights, mutual invitation, respectful guidelines. All this is to get to know one another, sharing stories. And that is very powerful when he goes into a situation where there's a lot of argument going on and a lot of decisions that need to be made. Time is going to be spent getting to know the person through his model. By the time the meeting comes where decisions need to be made, where there possibly could be a really Donnybrook, things tend to be a little bit calmer, and the anger is diffused. Because why? They know one another and they have respect for each other, so they can hear each other.
I was going to say that people have a way that they listen and the way that they react. We all have that. We all have that formula in our lives. If we learn how people think, we understand what their lens is, we can approach them from their lens, and it makes making those challenges that much simpler to face, because you're speaking to them in their language. Right? Instead of just the language you know. I'm not talking about English, Spanish, Italian, etc., but really in the mindset. You have to understand their mindset in order to create conversation that's positive and productive.
One of the lessons I trust we can also learn from this is truly the privilege and the importance of elections. It is so imperative now that we see if we are just mad at one group because they did this or this did that, or a particular person, then we do have a voice in this country. That's what's so wonderful about it. We can make that vote count, but if we stay on with, he's going to win anyway, she's going to win, then we don't take advantage of that voice. And I hope that we can learn from this to say, okay, what was being said? Do they believe how I believe? Can I follow through on that?
Yeah, and that's very much of a privilege and an honor and a responsibility for us to get out and vote. And I'm glad you mentioned that, the learning curve. What did we learn? What have we learned from these shutdowns? And to voice and put feet to your voice by voting, but also how can we reconcile with one another? What we've talked about, getting to know one another, that there is no heated discussion that can't be diffused so that people can make good decisions. And so maybe these shutdowns, when we see both people talking to one another and angrily shouting each other down and doing filibusters in Senate, what is the learning curve? What are we learning from that, so that we can help people in our community? Because sometimes we have the same thing in our community happen with city council, and of course in our communities of faith. I don't know if that happens or not in yours, but
well, I think even in our families. I mean, a lot of the people watching this right now, I mean, how many times have they had difficulties on a family level? Where they have, where the whole foundation and the premise of the interaction is argumentation, debate, and winning the debate or winning the argument. And oftentimes what can happen is you're thinking about your next retort, and you're not hearing a word that the other person, only insofar as you can defend what you're trying to say. And that's not listening. That's just basically.
And we're coming up to the time of Thanksgiving. We're just about a week away from Thanksgiving, and there will be a lot of debates around the Thanksgiving table. And I heard this one thing, the
You
talk.
can pick your friends.
Yeah, exactly. But on the talk today, they were mentioning that we should go ahead and have the person around the table that gets on your nerves bite your tongue, and then when you get in the car, then you can let it out in your trusted circle of friends. And maybe that's what we, as people of faith, it's a learning curve, and it's sharing with them. I think the best thing to do is how people can go ahead and share with one another and be heard. Be heard. Well, friends, thank you so much for being on today's show. And for those that are joining us in TV land, thank you very much for being with us today. Now, if you have any questions or comments, we ask that you will please send them to Clergy, LivingstonClergyAssociation.org. Until we meet again, may God's love be with you.